Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast, and Hunter is joining me on the podcast today. Hunter, so glad you're here.
It is so good to be here, and I'm not going to make a joke about how you tried to cancel me again, and I've revived my podcast livelihood.
Yeah, that never really was a danger, in spite of the number of times you've wanted to make that joke.
Well, we've worn it out, and I haven't come up with any new jokes, so what are we talking about today?
We are going to talk about an article today. It is called Why American Teens Are So Sad. It appeared in The Atlantic in April of this year and was written by a writer named Derek Thompson. So that's what we are talking about. Why are we talking about this article, Hunter?
I noticed this article when it first came out and thought this would be a great Vision for Life podcast conversation, and I forgot to send it to you, and then you sent it to me and said this would be a great Vision for Life podcast article to discuss, and I think we both brought it to mind primarily because we want to give our church vision for raising teenagers and being a church family where teenagers can grow up, be healthy adults, hopefully, and beyond that, be healthy disciples of Jesus. So we kind of have two goals for our kids. One is to be healthy, functioning adults. That's kind of goal A. That's the floor. And then the ultimate goal is to help many of them come to faith in Jesus and discover the gospel of Christ and to live as followers of Jesus. And the world we live in puts lots of pressure on followers of Jesus. It's never been friendly to discipleship to Jesus, but each culture puts particular pressures on followers of Christ, and our culture puts particular pressures on followers of Christ and makes it particularly difficult to develop into a functional adult, much less a functional adult that follows Jesus. And so we think it's important to be aware of what those pressures are, not so that we can be really anxious and angry about them, but so that we can proactively think about how we develop as disciples of Jesus and raise children. My grandma was a worrier. She obsessed about all the problems in her world at the time, and she worried. And I remember thinking, Meemaw is probably right about many of the problems in our world. At least she's right in the big picture sense. I mean, there may have been some particular views she had that were a little exaggerated in my adult opinion, but she was right. And yeah, I don't think she knew exactly what to do with what she read and what she saw on TV news. She was an early adopter of Fox News, so she was an early adopter of kind of the anxious cable news culture that many of us live in. And I don't think she knew what to do with it. And so really her only response was just to worry and to send me articles all the time about her, the things she was worried about. And she just worried. She was a worrier. And I don't want to condition our people to be worriers, because I think Jesus says, take heart, I've overcome the world. But before that, he goes, in the world, you'll have much trouble. So there is this realism that Jesus gives us, and there's real problems, and there's real evil, and there's real dangers in the world. And we also have an all-sufficient Word of God that if we'll dig deep into it and really root our lives deep into it, then we don't have to be anxious, but we do have to be really, really vigilant. So that's what we're trying to help our listeners do. That's the whole point of this podcast. That's why we call it Vision for Life.
From my vantage point as someone who leads children and family ministry at Fellowship Denver, I also want to help parents gain a sense of leading their kids in a way that allows them to experience the curiosity and wonder and joy that is inherent to kids that they carry more naturally. The Bible even gives us this picture of the beauty of simple, childlike faith and uses children as an example to us about how trust is, how beautiful it is in that sort of simple form. And all of those are natural qualities children have. And so we do want to raise our kids to be healthy, functioning adults who not only can make good decisions for them, but also are interested in the good of the people around them. And I want our parents also to be able to have a sense of how can we help our children in a world that feels increasingly difficult to navigate, maintain this sense of joy and wonder in these years of their life that as they move into adulthood, we naturally sort of lose and have to deal with more of the pressures of the world. And I think that there's this interesting dynamic at play because the answer is not simply in shielding them from everything, nor is it exposing them to everything. And so some of these articles like this one, I think help us wrestle with some of the social dynamics and also see some of what we as parents can do, and then the very clear areas in which we need to trust God. So that's one of my whys for wanting to discuss this article.
Well, I lean into your insight there, and this article is called Why American Teens Are So Sad. And then the subtitle is Four Forces Are Propelling the Rising Rates of Depression Among Young People. So the article begins by just noting that by any metric you use, depression is rising among teenagers. And the point they're trying to make is this transcends gender, this transcends race, and it's a historic trend that we're seeing where today more teens are reporting being depressed, or they are showing the classic symptoms of depression, such as, on extreme form, suicidal ideation. And there's something in the water that's causing that. They even acknowledge, hey, haven't teenagers always been angsty? Hasn't this always been a hard season of life? And they say, yeah, that is true. And yet there's something in the water today. They also make an important point. This trend started before COVID, so we can't just say the disruptions of COVID caused this. They do make the point that the disruptions that we've experienced in the last couple of years might have accelerated this, and I think that's really an important insight because often big events in the world accelerate trends that were already present there. They don't create them, but they accelerate them. So that they do make that point. But they're arguing, hey, this was going on before COVID, and historically this has been happening for a while, and it's kind of reached a tipping point. And so they're analyzing why is that the case.
That's true in our local context as well. The article cites national data and utilizes certain studies for the numbers that it cites about the rise in rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide among teens. There's a report that I've mentioned on the podcast before called Kids Count, and this is Colorado-specific data. One statement about adolescent mental health in the most recent edition of that report states, prior to the pandemic, Colorado's suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds had reached historically high levels, and suicides among 10 to 14-year-olds were becoming increasingly common as well. In total, 101 Colorado kids and teens, ages 10 to 19, lost their lives to suicide in 2020, up from 50 a decade prior. So in 1 year in the state of Colorado, we more than doubled the rate of suicides that had occurred among 10 to 19-year-olds in the decade prior. And that's just it's a concerning number and an interesting shift. Anecdotally, this is true for our middle and high school students at Fellowship as well. I wouldn't say that they all fit into this category of teenagers who would say they're lonely or anxious or depressed, but I think all of them have peers at school who they know have struggled with one of these, who either have a diagnosis of anxiety, depression, or talk about themselves in a sort of self-diagnosed way as having anxiety or depression, or have friends who have struggled with suicidal ideation as well. So even in our local context in the state of Colorado, and then our specific Fellowship Denver context, this is a concerning trend.
Well, I appreciate that you're kind of corroborating this with what we're seeing locally as well. And so if we take the article starting point as true, that teenage rates of depression mental health crises are rising. If that's true, the author of this article, who I've been calling a they, and it's actually not a they, it's a he, it's Derek Thompson. Sorry, Derek. Derek wants to say, here's 4 things that are contributing to this, four factors that are contributing to this. And I think these 4 factors then help us as Christians ask the bigger question, which is, so given that this is the environment we're living in, how do we, as a church and as families and as parents, how do we raise kids in a healthy way? But let me quickly summarize the 4 factors. The first one he mentions is social media use. And he makes a fascinating point here. He compares it to alcohol. So he says social media use is not so much rat poison as it is alcohol. And the reason that's important is, think about, if you and I both drink rat poison, we're both going to die because we drank rat poison. But if you and I both use social media, I will probably use it in a healthy way, and you will probably develop an unhealthy addiction to it and become a depressed person with low self-image because I'm just healthier than you, right? So the idea here is, he's mentioning, is social media kind of functions like alcohol, and that a lot of teens probably use it in a fairly benign kind of way. I mean, there may be some slight problems that come from it, but it's not driving them into depression. But studies are showing that for some teens, it really does drive them into really low self-image, a lot of anxiety. And if that starts to happen, even in a minority percentage, if that starts to happen across a society, it affects the whole. In the same way, we might think, if we have a family of 20 people and 2 of them become alcoholics, it probably affects the whole family in a negative way.
Yeah. There's a specific quote Derek Thompson includes in what you were just explaining, in which he says, it's more like alcohol, a mildly addictive substance that can enhance social situations, but also lead to dependency and depression among minorities of users. So this is the first reason that the author offers as far as what is driving rates of anxiety and depression and sadness among American teens is social media use. What is the second observation?
The second one is that sociality is down. So if social media usage is up, sociality, like spending time doing things in person, is down. And the key quote here is this: compared with their counterparts in the 2000s. So now if we're going back 15 to 20 years, compared with their counterparts in the 2000s, teens today are less likely to go out with their friends, get their driver's license, or play youth sports. So these are just like three social things that teens have historically done for long periods of time in America, even going back 15, 20 years. And he's saying that's going down.
He includes in that section, in the observation about actual personal interaction, that sort of sociality going down, that there is this nuance between aloneness and loneliness and depression. But he does conclude more aloneness, including from heavy smartphone use, and more loneliness, including from school closures, and that is alluding to the effects of COVID that you mentioned before, Hunter, might have combined to push up sadness among teenagers who need sociality to protect them from the pressures of a stressful world. So there's this real interaction between heavier social media use and less sociality, some of that which was driven by the pandemic, as he's observing.
And I like to think of and imagine how these things build. So the third one is this: the world is stressful, and there's more news about the world's stressors, which we could then say that we probably get more news about the world's stressors because we're all tuned into social media. And we are having this conversation in just the days after the elementary school shooting in Texas, where I think it's now 19 children plus one teacher lost their lives. And one thing I've noticed is how every parent is having to ask, how do I talk to my kids about this? Because we are so wired and so connected that it's just assumed our kids are going to know about this. And that's happening with a cavalcade of just bad news. He says, in the last decade, teenagers have become increasingly stressed by concerns about gun violence, climate change, and the political environment. Increased stress among young people is linked to increasing levels of sadness. Girls more than boys are socialized to internalize distress, meaning that they tend to collapse in on themselves by becoming depressed or anxious.
And what is the fourth observation that the author is making?
The last one he calls modern parenting strategies. And the big idea is that parents themselves are anxious in this highly socially connected world where we're hearing about all these stressors. Parents themselves are anxious, and parents themselves are worried, and that's caused them to become more protective of their children. And in protecting their children from the dangers of the world, they actually increase the anxiety of their children. And so this was probably the most fascinating point to me, but it's basically, it's kind of counterintuitive. It's saying, hey, if you hear about all these dangers in the world and you hear about all these problems and you're concerned about all that's going on, the temptation parents have is to say, I've got to hold my children tight and I can't expose them to all these things that might harm them. And then that actually makes them more afraid of all those things and more worried about all of those things. And so it just creates this kind of downward spiral.
He and other authors and commentators have called what you're talking about an accommodative parenting style. And he includes a simple illustration that's really helpful. He says, if a girl is afraid of dogs, an accommodation would be keeping her away from every friend's house with a dog. Or if a boy won't eat vegetables, feeding him nothing but turkey loaf for 4 years. And then, in parentheses, an actual story that he links to. These behaviors come from love, but part of growing up is learning how to release negative emotions in the face of inevitable stress. If kids never figure out how to do that, they're more likely to experience severe anxiety as teenagers. And as you said, these four factors that Derek Thompson is talking about do build on each other. And one of the interesting interplays between 3, the exposure to more bad news, particularly from online sources, and 4, which is modern parenting styles, are a dynamic that occurs in which kids may be exposed to more information and more mature information in online spaces. So in a sense, they're being forced to grow up more quickly when they're encountered with those things in social media or via the internet. In the modern parenting, though, end of this dynamic, they are growing up more slowly, as in they're not being allowed to experience certain things like driving or like being faced with inevitable stressors in life because of the protective parenting style that so many modern parents have adopted. So there's this interesting dynamic kids being forced to grow up more quickly online and more slowly in real life experiential ways.
A parallel to this that came to mind as I was reading this, I was recently talking to a friend who works in healthcare, and she was telling me that one of the problems she is seeing in her work is that doctors are sometimes prescribing treatments for children that the parents are demanding, and the doctors know that these treatments aren't really helpful and don't really do anything, but they simply make the parents feel better that they are doing something. And so they'll do it. They'll do these elective procedures just to make the children or the parents feel better about their kids. And that's a classic example of like accommodation. And what accommodation really comes down to is we try to manage feelings. So good feelings become so important that we just try to help everyone feel good, even if we know, like, okay, this is not going to really do anything, but it's going to make you feel better, so we do it anyway. And when a society gets more into managing feelings than into actual reality, we just kind of lose touch. And the point Thompson is making is this emphasis on feeling good actually doesn't even in the long run make people feel good. It just makes them more depressed. There's a fascinating novel about this very dynamic written in 1971 by Walker Percy called Love in the Ruins. And he actually saw all of this coming, where we just try to become a society that manages feelings and sometimes using medical intervention. And he foresaw all this doom that was coming 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's such an interesting, insightful observation, Hunter. I was reading something similarly recently that talked about how things that used to be categorized as just general sadness are now being labeled depression. And it is exactly that, an attempt to manage bad feelings or feelings that we want to avoid.
Well, so that we don't all become my meemaw and just fret and worry about this, but rather proactively, positively live as God's called us to. Taking the insights of this article, what are some things we can give our listeners to do, or how can we kind of turn this in a proactive direction to say, okay, what can we do with this?
Yeah, in our desire to say we want to help our children enjoy their childhood, and we want to raise healthy kids who become healthy adults, and we want to grow a healthy church family that enjoys life together and enjoys the good aspects of God's kingdom that He's given us to enjoy and appreciate each other. I'm thankful that you asked this question, Hunter. So we shift into this part of our discussion.
This is where we now leave the article and we just talk about it. What thoughts it provoked for us.
Yeah. I think the first observation that we want to discuss is that there are actually many things beyond our control. Some of these major cultural shifts, some of what the article is observing, access to online news, how prevalent information is, social media, all of these things are really present in our world and accessible to us. And we can control a small part of that, how we respond or how we engage it. But the actual presence of those things is not something we can control. So the climate and the environment in which we live, these major social shifts, the fact that we did just live through a pandemic, all of those things are outside our control.
There's a lot we can't control. And with the amount of information that we have in the world today, my temptation is to think that if I just get enough information and understand something better, I can gain a measure of control over it. So one of the ways I try to gain control is by understanding something, being able to explain it and break it down. And I saw that happening in COVID. I was very tempted to go, if I could just understand all this, if I could get my mind around all this data, then I could figure out the right approach to COVID and then do what with it? I'm not going to be able to change what our government is doing. But I think there's a temptation to think we need to control the environment, and you're making the point that we really can't. Now, I would then ask, okay, so how's that helpful? and the way that is helpful to me is it causes me to lean into the sovereignty of God and my capacity to trust my Father in heaven. So I'm called to cast all my anxieties on Him. And this is not just a way of kind of managing my emotions. This is a way of staying sane in the world so that I can follow Christ. I have to trust my Father, and I even have to trust that He's sovereign, meaning that He even allows these cultural conditions to exist. And we see this in the book of Revelation, for example. We see a church that is living through a period after the resurrection and the ascension of Christ, a world that is in tribulation and distress. And it is the problems that we all deal with. It's plagues, and it's famines, and it's wars and rumors of war, and it's social breakdown, and it's bad ideas and bad teaching, and it's sexual immorality. It's all of the stuff that we live through. And the message of Revelation is God is sovereign. He's working history toward His appointed end, and He's using these things that are happening in the world. He's using this to pour out judgment on people and also to sanctify and purify His church, His people. And it's all working for the good and the glory of His church. So I have to step back and say, God the Father, who is sovereign over world history and all the events, wants to use this jacked up culture that I just read 4 bullet points about in The Atlantic, and I now understand a little bit better. He wants to use that to purify His people, to purify His church, and to draw people to Himself. So that helps me not freak out, but it helps me to ask, okay, how do we live proactively?
You cited the passage earlier in our conversation that said Jesus stated he had overcome the world. He told his disciples and followers that, and Revelation puts it on display. It creates a picture for us.
Jesus says, "In the world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world." We might think of the book of Revelation as just an exploration of that theme, basically, and a calling of the church to faithfulness and trust and confidence in God and devotion to his word in the midst of a world that is troubled. One of the ways I got to practice this, or had to practice this recently, was at the beginning of the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was mad about the way our government, to be honest, was, or our officials were responding to the pandemic. I did not think the shutdowns that we were doing were good for us socially. And I wasn't totally sure they were going to do anything to stop the spread of the virus or do a whole lot. But I was really concerned about all the social side effects that some of which they're citing here. And I was really, really frustrated. And I got really tired of hearing things like the pandemic has caused this shutdown. I was like, no, it's not the pandemic that's caused the shutdown. It's our choice to respond in this way. So, I got really agitated. And I started to take to social media to rant a little bit. And one day I was walking around praying, which is one of the best things you can do in a world like ours, is to take long walks and pray and to work out all the things you're frustrated about. And I was walking around praying, and I was arguing with God about this and telling him how frustrated I was. And I in a weird kind of clear as day way, I sensed the Spirit saying, "Calm yourself down." Calm yourself down. You cannot control even what the mayor of Denver does, which would seem like maybe I could call the mayor or lobby the mayor. Nope, you can't even control the mayor of Denver, much less these big health institutions. You can't control the government. You are not going to be able to control, even if you understand, you're not going to be able to control the society-wide response. Your choice is whether you're going to calmly and lead the church and the people I've given you to lead through this, or if you're just going to whine and complain about it. And I felt really convicted. And so I wrote it in my journal, and I committed I'm going to have a fundamental attitude shift toward this pandemic. And that is, I'm going to be informed about what's going on, and I'm going to try to understand, but I'm not going to try to control. Rather, I'm going to do what I can do, which is keep myself calm and point our church to the sufficiency of Scripture and lead our church to follow Christ through it. And it was just one of those kind of Holy Spirit moments. But the point is, I had to lean into the sovereignty of God. I had to actually believe God has ordained this for his purposes, and he's going to accomplish his will. He's going to even purify and strengthen the church if I'll trust him to do that. He can do that through this. And so I think that's the attitude we have to take toward a lot of things in our world today.
Mm-hmm. Because Jesus tells us those things directly, that in the world we will have difficulty, we will have struggle, we will have trial, and that he has overcome the world. For his followers, if we refuse to believe or engage with either of those realities, then there's a strange sort of hubris that we end up exercising and hanging on to fear and anxiety and control. It doesn't mean that it isn't still a struggle, that what we face isn't actually difficult. But in that sort of failure to acknowledge either of those realities, we can end up taking on something that we aren't intended actually to carry.
I would just add, so we're not advocating for some kind of passivity of just sitting by and letting what happens. We're actually advocating for actively involving yourself in the things you can control and you do have a measure of agency over, which is your family, is yourself, maybe your immediate social environment. That's what most of us have control over. And trusting God in his sovereignty with things you don't have control over.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So that's our first. Most things, many things are beyond our control, but they're not beyond God's control. What is the second point that we wanted to discuss?
The second point is hard to summarize, but I'm going to try to summarize it like this. We all live in social and relational systems, meaning we are connected to other people. And most of those systems we're connected to, we can define. At the most basic unit of society, a family or a marriage is a social system. A marriage is two people. So if you're married, you're in a relationship with one other person at least. A family is a social system. It's a relational system. There's ways that a family does things. If you've ever interacted with someone from a different family, you know, like not all families do everything the same. Like some families handle conflict by yelling and shouting and arguing it out. Some families handle conflict by calmly sitting down and talking about it. Some families handle conflict by not talking about it at all and just moving on to sports, right? So like we those are relational systems. So we all exist within relational systems. You could probably then just name the relational systems of your life. If you're involved in a church, your church is a relational system. If your kids are in school, your school is a relational system. Your work environment is a relational system. And then there's kind of this bigger relational system that we can't quite define, but it's just our society at large. We all live in a society. That's a relational system. Okay. There's been some great work done in the last 20, 30 years on how do relational systems get healthy or how do they get unhealthy and destructive? Like, we just know there's some families that if you put people into them, they grow and they flourish in those families. And there's other families, if you put people into them, the people in that family tend to all wind up hurt and disheveled. There's some churches, if you put people into them, they grow. And there's some churches that if you put people into them, they wind up weirdly less in love with Jesus and his church, right? So what causes that? And it's the dynamics of the system itself. There's been a lot of good work done on this. Some of the insights from that I think are really applicable here. One of them is that the key to health in a system is for the healthiest or the most mature people to stay healthy. And so there's a local author who's done a lot of work in this. He's a pastor for years, and now he has a ministry helping churches and nonprofits and other organizations work through this. His name's Steve Cuss, and one of Steve's classic illustrations is when you're on a plane, the flight attendant will say, "In the event of a loss of cabin pressure, put your own oxygen mask on first, and then assist your children or those who need help." And it's just the idea that like if you don't stay breathing, you're not gonna be able to help anyone else. So in a system, for the most mature people to stay healthy is how a system stays healthy. And so what that means for those of us who have responsibility in any relational system. So if you're a parent, you have responsibility in the relational system of your family. If I'm a pastor, I have responsibility.
If you're a parent, you're supposed to be one of the most mature people in your family system.
That's right. That's right. It is for me to stay healthy. That's the first point, right? Back to my illustration earlier. I really felt that when I was wrestling with the response to COVID and my own anxiousness. I thought, if I don't get out of this spiral that I'm in, then I'm probably going to drag down a lot of people in our church as well.
Yeah. Within those systems, what ends up happening is, you've said before, Hunter, then the person who is struggling with that, but actually holds this mature presence and responsibility, they end up foisting that anxiety onto the other people who they're connected with.
Counselors who have helped families with this will sometimes notice that if one member of a family is struggling with something like an addiction, it's very tempting for all the members of the family to go and focus on trying to fix the person who's struggling with the addiction. Let's all get involved and let's try to fix that person. And the counselors have noticed, actually, the best thing you can do is help the non-addictive members of the family just function at a higher level. And so the counselors will focus on supporting the healthy people, not on fixing the unhealthy person, which is a fascinating dynamic. So what does all this mean? I think it all means especially for parents, and I would apply this to our whole church family. For parents, for you to be healthy followers of Christ and healthy people, and to have a healthy marriage is one of the best things you can give to your children who are living in this pressure cooker of a world that this author is describing.
Mm-hmm. When we discuss this in our specific family ministry spaces, so in forums with parents or with our team members, we have one aspect of family ministry that we call gospel renewal at home. And what I stress with parents is exactly what you said, Hunter, and for this reason, that the most crucial part of discipleship at home is you yourself having a vibrant, real relationship with God and experiencing gospel renewal in your own life. It is almost impossible to help your children develop that if you yourself aren't experiencing the renewal of the gospel.
And at a very simple level, we all know there's people that when we're with them, it just kind of raises us up to be with them. They may or may not be in kind of what we would call encouragers. Like they may or may not be these people that are always, saying positive things, but their presence, their maturity just tends to call us up a little bit. And that's that just in a two-person system. I was with a friend last week who doesn't live here in Denver, and I probably see him, a handful of times each year. And I was just reminded when I was having dinner with him, like, I'm just always better when I spend some time with him. I think more clearly about things. I'm less worried about things. He just raises my game, and so we're advocating that our parents become and work on being people who love Jesus, who have a vibrant relationship with Christ, who are not sucked in by the anxiety of the world. That is one of the best gifts that you can give your children.
Mm-hmm. Within this relational systems discussion, within this theory, it's called a non-anxious presence. And when you described, when I'm with this person, it makes me feel like this. They have this sort of wisdom and insight and stability. And I think that that's how it's explained in terminology as the people who we enjoy being with, who seem to help us feel less anxious. They have this sort of presence, a non-anxious presence. And for us, whether we're a part of our Fellowship Denver family or if you're a parent listening to this, I think the source of that for you as a follower of Jesus is that it is that relationship through Jesus with the Father that enables us to see that we have these struggles and trials, that Jesus has overcome the world, and that because we're connected to him, he gives us that ability also.
If our listeners are interested in exploring this more, the author Mark Sayers just published a book a few weeks ago called A Non-Anxious Presence. And he takes this idea, works it through Scripture, talks about living this way, connected to God in the current world that we live in. And so it's not a very long book, really helpful, and highly recommend it. Maybe a future Vision for Life podcast subject.
Probably. All right. Noted. I'm taking notes right now, Hunter. All right. So the first, many things are beyond our control, but they're not beyond God's control. The second is that we can maintain through connection with God this sort of non-anxious presence that brings health and stability to our families, to our churches, to any sort of relational system that you're connected to.
And I want you to give our listeners the third one, because when we were talking about this before we sat down to record, you said it really, really well, and I was taking notes, so I'm going to do that again.
I think the third is stable family units. So referring back to the article, one observation that Derek Thompson made but doesn't discuss as one of the primary factors that he's highlighting is that a sixth of the increase in teen suicides are associated with parental opioid addiction. And over the course of the last many months, as we've come through the pandemic and we've seen all of these, the catalyzation of so many of these social shifts, I've been reading so many of these same articles. I don't know, Hunter, maybe it has something to do with trying to understand something to gain a sense of control. But regardless, I've been reading a lot of these articles, and so many of the authors and journalists and commentators who I've been reading and listening to allude to this dynamic that destabilized family units are a part of. They don't know exactly, or I haven't read exactly how they posit this is driving teen rates of sadness, loneliness, anxiety, and depression, but all of them sort of give this nod to it, that there's this aspect of parenting, accommodative parenting, yes, but then also there's another social reality that has to do with the destabilization of the family unit in modern American life. And none of them can say there's this direct causation, but all of them observe that there is this correlation. So you mentioned when we were discussing relational systems theory a moment ago, stable homes, that one of the best things parents can do is to work on their relationship with each other and with their children. And I think in this, in encouraging what the church can do, what we can do is to provide a community that encourages gospel renewal at home and encourages stable family units. So working on your marriage, as far as parents listening, is one of the best things you can do for your kids. And setting aside time to spend with God, to develop your own relationship with God, and then to share that with your kids in word and in the way you go about living your life is one of the best things you can do for your kids that I think counteracts these cultural forces we're seeing.
And you, when we were talking about this, you had kind of a second insight too, which was not only can you have a stable home and marriage and family, but you can also develop other relationships for your family that are life-giving and helpful. Unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah, the historical trend has been that in America, in a country that has experienced quite a bit of prosperity and stability, the focus has been on the nuclear family unit for many decades now. And so the way that that gets interpolated into church context also is working on your family, providing a stable home for your children, and working on your marriage, and all of those are good things. But I think that this other aspect of how we're woven into the fabric of our society is maybe only minimally less important. This idea of the nuclear family unit doesn't exist in the same way in many other cultures, particularly Eastern cultures. And because it has become this central idea that's gained so much importance and sway in America, particularly since the sexual revolution, the destabilization of the family unit has had this very real effect on our overall life. We see the effects in kids particularly. So in many observations about schools and achievement, so many of those factors are tied back to what is the situation at home and whether or not there's stability or two parents in the home. All of those things are tied back to this family unit. So I think for parents listening, it's equally important to model healthy relationships with many different kinds of people and to help your children understand how important that aspect of living as image bearers of God who are created to be these incredibly social beings, how that actually looks. And this too counteracts the effect of isolation that's driven by social media use.
I have some friends who say, we want our kids to experience that we have some adult friends who are also their friends and who are for them. So, they've said to me, they don't even live in Denver, but they've said to me, we want our kids to look to you as one of their friends and one of their examples. And so what this practically means is a few times a year, we get together whenever we're in the same space, or sometimes we just go to see each other, and I hang out with their family, and I've gotten to watch their kids grow up. And that's important to them as parents. And they've done that with lots of people, not just me. I can also think about how this can include extended family. For me, I can remember my grandparents gave me some things that my parents couldn't give me, or they gave me some things in a way my parents didn't give me. So like my grandfather, I had one grandfather growing up. My grandfather modeled some things about manhood that were not better than my dad. They were just different than the way my dad lived, and seeing like another kind of man and how he loved his wife and how he served his wife and what he did with his life, like that broadened my perspective in a really, really good way and gave me some things that I wouldn't have had if I was just confined to my nuclear family, as you're saying. And I think what you're pointing us to is that the nuclear family is most important, but it's not the only family or relational line that God has given us. Mm-hmm. And within the body of Christ, we even have the resources of this broader family of Christ.
One of the greatest gifts as a parent in the years that I've been here at Fellowship has been watching adults really invest in and love my children. And this also has implications for the way that we structure our upper elementary classes mm-hmm. here at Fellowship and our student fellowship, which is our ministry for middle and high schoolers. We ask our teachers and our leaders to commit at a high level so that they can actually get to know the children and develop stable relationships over many years that allow them to invest deeply and model that sort of relationship for our kids, but also to provide example for mm-hmm. them. Like you just said about watching your grandpa, this allows our kids to see other adults who are seeking to follow Jesus, who probably are in different life stages or have some different perspectives. Their lives maybe look different, but our children can see them following God and making choices in the ways they go about life that are really meaningful for them over the long term. This has the same effect for us as parents, though. Choosing to maintain healthy, stable friendships with many different kinds of people is effective in our lives, and that has a reciprocal effect in the lives of our kids. It has this aspect of modeling, but it also carries this genuine value in the way that we experience life and stability then in weaving our lives together with people around us.
Well, Autumn, thanks for bringing this article back to my attention and bringing this conversation up. This has been really thought-provoking for me, and I hope it has for our listeners as well.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. You're not canceled. You're not canceled from the Vision for Life podcast, Hunter.
It's good. I fear that I'm not going to be canceled from the Vision for Life podcast, but I could be canceled in other forms of life. So as long as I have this connection, I think I can stay healthy in this world.
You know, things we can't know, things that maybe are beyond our control. So, well, thank you for joining me today. And for those of you listening, if you have questions about today's episode or a suggestion for what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of those things anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.